Victoria Sterling had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, stared down hostile boards without once lowering her voice, and survived a divorce dissected by financial media as if heartbreak were just another quarterly event. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the moment. Her own voice almost failed inside a candlelit restaurant 40 floors above Manhattan. The private dining room shimmered with gold reflections and city light, the skyline burning behind the glass like a second universe suspended outside the window. Every detail had been arranged with ruthless precision. The corner table, the silence between courses, the wine she knew he liked, but rarely allowed himself to order the exact hour when the city looked expensive enough to resemble certainty. Across from her sat James Carter, broad-shouldered, calm, dressed in a dark suit that made him look as composed as the skyline itself, his hands resting near the untouched glass of water he always reached for before answering difficult questions. He had spent the last year becoming the one person in her world who did not bend when power entered the room, the one man who spoke truth, even when executives hated hearing it. The one father whose tired smile beside his daughter in a crowded school gym had unsettled her more deeply than any polished declaration from men who had spent fortunes trying to impress her. Victoria had rehearsed market defenses, legal strategies, investor recoveries, but not vulnerability. Yet tonight, vulnerability arrived before caution could stop it. She lifted her eyes to his and asked softly, but without retreat, "Will you be my husband?" For one impossible second, Manhattan seemed to stop breathing. No clink of silverware, no distant elevator hum, no movement from the discreet waiter behind the partition. James did not answer. His face remained unreadable, but the silence that formed between them was not empty, it was heavy, dangerous like the second before a bridge either holds or collapses. Victoria felt her pulse rise into her throat. She had expected surprise, perhaps even emotion, but not this unbearable stillness. Then his eyes softened, and that softness frightened her more than refusal would have, because in that look she saw love, real love, and something else. Something painful enough to ruin the night before either of them moved. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, devastating. "I love you, Victoria." Relief hit too early, too fast. Then he finished each word landing with surgical precision. "But I won't marry the part of you that's asking because it's afraid to be left alone." The city glittered beneath them, merciless and beautiful, while for the first time in years, Victoria Sterling realized she had walked into a conversation where power could not save her. 6 months before that night above Manhattan, before the candlelight, before the proposal that would leave her unable to breathe, Victoria Sterling was still the kind of woman financial magazines described with words like relentless, surgical, untouchable. At 38, she stood at the center of sterling logic like someone built from steel, and deliberate silence a CEO whose decisions moved markets before analysts finished predicting them, whose interviews circulated online because she never smiled unless she meant it, and almost never meant it in public. The 42nd floor executive office where she began most mornings looked exactly like the reputation she had built. Glass walls, muted art, precise lines, no softness that had not been chosen for strategic effect. Outside Manhattan climbed in mirrored towers. Inside every sound carried authority, leather folders opening, assistants speaking quietly, investors waiting half a beat longer than they wanted, because her time had value, and everyone in the building understood that fact instinctively. Yet beneath the immaculate order, there was a fatigue she had become skilled at disguising, a quiet fracture left behind by a divorce, finalized only 4 months earlier. A marriage that had ended not with scandal, but with the colder humiliation of discovering that two ambitious people could remain elegant while becoming strangers. Her ex-husband had walked away with public dignity, legal efficiency, and the kind of practiced calm that made headlines call the separation mature, but Victoria knew maturity had nothing to do with it. They had simply run out of honesty long before they ran out of appearances. Since then, she had done what she always did when pain threatened structure. She worked harder, slept less, answered every emotional disturbance with another acquisition call, another strategy session, another evening where the city lit up outside her penthouse, while the silence inside felt louder than traffic below. That morning, the silence broke when Daniel Reeves entered carrying final candidate files for Project Atlas, the most important infrastructure transition Sterling Logic had attempted in years. Atlas was not merely technical. It was political, tied to expansion investor promises and a board already impatient enough to mistake speed for intelligence. Victoria barely looked up at first as Daniel summarized names, but when he placed one final folder in front of her, something in his tone shifted. "One more candidate for final interview," he said. "Strongest technical profile by far. There's a 3-year gap." Victoria opened the folder. The name on top read James Carter. The resume immediately felt different from the polished noise she saw every day. No inflated adjectives, no decorative claims, just hard architecture work, complex systems built under pressure. Respected references, and then the gap stated plainly, almost stubbornly stepped away for custody responsibilities. No attempt to disguise it, no strategic wording. "Why the gap?" she asked, without lifting her eyes. Daniel answered divorce. Daughter. Full custody for a while. Victoria paused longer than she intended. Most executives preferred candidates who explained personal sacrifice like branding material. Something about the plainness irritated her and interested her at once. Bring him in. The next morning, the conference room overlooking the avenue was bright with hard daylight, the kind that made honesty difficult because nowhere in the room allowed hiding. HR sat to her left, legal across from Daniel, and Victoria remained at the head of the table only because Atlas justified her presence. Governance rules were already clear. Whoever won the role would report through Daniel, not through her directly, because visible companies did not survive avoidable speculation. At precisely 9, James Carter entered. He wore a charcoal suit that fit without vanity, carried no nervous performance in his shoulders, and moved with the unsettling steadiness of a man who did not need approval to remain composed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, serious, without hardness, and his first handshake revealed the thing Victoria noticed before she wanted to notice anything at all. He met power without leaning toward it. No extra smile, no calculated warmth. He greeted Daniel HR legal, then her each with the same measured respect, and sat only when invited. The interview began conventionally enough. Architecture scale, migration, failure points, resilience, design, rollback logic. James answered with exact clarity, not once reaching for unnecessary brilliance when simple truth would do. When HR pushed deeper into load assumptions, he corrected their framework without arrogance. When legal asked about liability under staged rollout, he outlined risks so precisely that even Daniel stopped taking notes and simply listened. Then Daniel asked the question every room eventually asks when a resume contains silence. "Tell us about the 3 years away." The room changed instantly. Victoria had seen this moment dozens of times. Good candidates usually performed vulnerability like an accessory offering pain in acceptable quantities. James did not. He folded his hands, once looked at Daniel and said, "My ex-wife relocated after the divorce. Our custody arrangement collapsed for a while. My daughter needed stability more than I needed momentum, so I stepped away from full-time leadership. No apology, no softening." HR asked carefully, "You weren't concerned about career damage?" He answered without hesitation, "Of course it damaged my career. That just wasn't the question in front of me." Something invisible tightened in Victoria's chest. She disliked how quickly the answer entered somewhere deeper than professional assessment. Legal asked how he stayed current. James listed contract work, night certifications, architecture, reviews, open source systems, everything done after bedtime because his daughter slept in the next room. Again, no heroism in his tone, only fact. Victoria spoke before deciding to. Would you make the same decision again? The room fell still because everyone heard what that question really was. It was no longer hiring protocol. James turned directly toward her, his eyes steady enough to feel personal even though the answer belonged to everyone there. Yes. No pause. My daughter only gets one childhood. Titles return. Certain years don't. The sentence stayed suspended longer than it should have. Victoria looked down at the file only to hide the fact that something had shifted unexpectedly inside her some guarded place, responding before reason approved it. By the time the interview ended, Daniel was convinced HR satisfied legal unconcerned. Officially hiring him was simple. Unofficially, Victoria kept replaying his answers long after the room emptied. 2 weeks later, James joined Atlas, and within days the atmosphere around the project changed. Meetings that had drifted into decorative optimism suddenly acquired weight because he refused decorative language. He did not dominate rooms loudly. He altered them by making weak assumptions impossible to survive. The first collision happened during a Monday strategy review when a senior vice president presented the accelerated rollout timeline. The board preferred a timeline polished enough to impress people who never had to repair failure after applause ended. Daniel asked for concerns. Silence followed the familiar corporate silence where truth calculates whether honesty is worth career damage. Then James spoke. This schedule fails under real stress. The sentence landed flat and clean. The vice president smiled thinly. That's a strong claim. James nodded once. Accurate claims usually sound strong when people already know they're true. Several executives shifted. Victoria said nothing because she wanted to see whether confidence would crack under pressure. It did not. James walked through dependency failures, authentication vulnerabilities, and failure cascades with such calm precision that resistance began sounding emotional by comparison. The vice president tried to recover authority. The board wants acceleration, James answered. The architecture does not care what the board wants. A silence sharper than before filled the room. One finance executive muttered, "They won't like 10 extra weeks." James looked toward the projection screen, not the speaker. They'll dislike public collapse more. Victoria should have intervened sooner, but she found herself watching him instead. The still posture, the refusal to weaponize, toned the total absence of performance. Men around power usually bent toward strategy. James behaved as though truth itself were the only thing worth protecting. Finally, she closed the presentation deck. We revised the timeline, she said. Groans stayed unspoken. The meeting dissolved. Later that afternoon, she found him alone in a smaller conference room studying architecture maps projected across a wall screen. He did not look startled when she entered, only stepped slightly aside to make room as if authority required no theater between them. You made several people unhappy today, she said. That happens, he answered. Eyes still on the system diagram when deadlines stopped pretending to be engineering. You could have been more diplomatic. He finally turned toward her. Possibly. But the risk wouldn't change. The answer should have irritated her. Instead, unexpectedly, she laughed a short reel sound she had not intended to give him. His expression shifted, faint surprise crossing his face because he clearly had not aimed for charm. That more than charm unsettled her. She studied him in the pale reflection of the screen light, composed, tired in ways only close attention noticed, carrying some older dignity that did not seek permission to exist. For the first time since her divorce, Victoria left a difficult meeting, thinking not about the board, not about headlines, not about investor reaction, but about one man standing under a wall of system maps refusing to lie because lying would have been easier. And she understood with sudden, dangerous clarity that attraction did not always arrive like fire. Sometimes it entered quietly disguised as respect and stayed long enough to become impossible to ignore. The first time Victoria Sterling saw how completely different James Carter became, outside the glass discipline of Sterling Logic, happened on a Saturday she had almost skipped. Sterling Logic was sponsoring a neighborhood STEM fair in Brooklyn, one of those public-facing events her communications team loved because cameras captured executives smiling beside children and science projects while investors interpreted civic warmth as leadership depth. Victoria arrived late, delivered her short remarks, shook hands with donors posed beside a robotics table, and intended to leave within 20 minutes because she still had a board memo waiting on her dining table and 2 calls scheduled before evening. Then she heard a little girl's voice behind one of the folding tables say with complete seriousness, "Dad, that is not structural engineering. That is wishful thinking." The sentence made her turn before she could decide not to. There, kneeling beside a half-built bridge made of recycled Styx wire and colored connectors, was James in a faded navy sweater instead of office tailoring. One sleeve pushed up his broad hands carefully holding one side of the model, while a little girl with tight curls and bright, suspicious eyes corrected him with the authority of someone entirely certain she was right. He looked up when he noticed Victoria, and for a brief second the guarded precision she knew from work vanished into genuine surprise. "Ms. Sterling," he said, standing. The girl immediately looked between them as if assessing whether this elegantly dressed stranger deserved access to their table. Victoria crouched slightly until she was level with the child's eyes, something she almost never did for anyone in public because lowering herself felt strangely intimate. "You must be the engineer," she said. The girl considered her carefully before answering. "I'm Ava Carter." Her tone suggested introductions were being granted conditionally. Victoria glanced at the bridge. "Does your design have test data?" Ava blinked, then frowned in concentration. "Not yet." "Then your father may have a point." James's mouth moved as if suppressing a smile, and for the next 10 minutes Victoria stayed there while Ava explained weight distribution with absolute seriousness, correcting her father twice, and treating each correction as a matter of scientific dignity. What unsettled Victoria was not the child's intelligence, though that alone was striking. It was the way James listened. He gave his daughter the same full attention he gave system failures in executive meetings. No distraction, no indulgent half-listening, no performance of patience. Full presence. The gym around them remained loud with parents' paper signs, teachers calling names, but inside that small circle, James made the half-finished bridge feel like the most important thing in the room. Victoria knew powerful men who controlled funds, buildings, campaigns, reputations. Very few could kneel on a school gym floor and make an 8-year-old feel that her unfinished project mattered more than power itself. When Ava ran off to find her teacher, Victoria and James were left standing beside the folding table under fluorescent light and hanging student banners. "You look different here," she said before she could stop herself. James folded the extra wires into a plastic tray. "Because I'm arguing about glue instead of infrastructure. Because you're not braced for impact." He looked at her, then really looked, and some softer truth passed through his expression before he answered. "This is the easier job. Being a parent," she asked. He nodded once. "Harder physically. Easier morally. She needs what she needs. Adults complicate everything because they pretend they don't." The sentence followed Victoria home that night to her penthouse, where floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a city she owned pieces of, but did not inhabit emotionally. She stood in her kitchen later than midnight, holding a glass of water she forgot to drink, thinking not about the board memo waiting unopened, but about James kneeling beside his daughter as though the world had narrowed correctly around what mattered. 2 weeks later, after a late systems review that stretched beyond 9, James mentioned casually while gathering his notes that Ava was disappointed Victoria had not seen whether the bridge survived load testing. Victoria opened her drawer, removed one of her private cards, and handed it to him with studied lightness. "In case the engineer wants to submit official results," she said. He took the card, looked at it once, then at her. "Or," she lifted one shoulder. "Or in case you ever ignore perfectly obvious signs of collapse." That sounds uncomfortably specific. It usually is. He left with the faintest trace of amusement in his face, and Victoria told herself the exchange meant nothing beyond civility. She believed that for almost 12 days. Then the call came on a rainy Thursday night while she was alone in her office reading a compliance brief no one else wanted to handle until morning. Her assistant transferred the call because the number had no name attached. Victoria answered absently, eyes still on the document, until a small voice said, "Ms. Victoria." She stood instantly. Ava fear sharpened everything at once. "Dad is sick." The child's voice trembled only slightly, which made it more frightening. Victoria asked 3 questions in 10 seconds, breathing fever talking, and while Ava answered, Victoria was already reaching for her coat. "Stay on the phone," she said. "I'm coming." Rain slowed traffic, but she arrived in Harlem in 23 minutes, climbed 2 flights, and found the apartment door unlocked exactly as Ava had been instructed to leave it. The apartment startled her, not because it was modest, but because it felt so unmistakably lived in. A backpack near the door, a stack of folded school papers held by magnets on the refrigerator, a half-cut apple on the counter, bills clipped neatly beside an inhaler refill reminder, a child's sneakers drying near the radiator. Nothing arranged for impression. Everything arranged for function. Ava stood in striped pajamas, trying very hard not to cry. Victoria touched her shoulder once, then moved directly to the bedroom where James lay under a blanket flushed with fever, stubborn enough to look irritated by being discovered weak. "You called her?" he asked hoarsely when he saw Ava behind Victoria. "I called the person who answers," Ava replied, which nearly broke something inside Victoria because the answer carried such practical trust. She took control before emotion could interfere. Temperature, medication, telehealth consult, water timing doses, opening windows slightly because the room was too warm. James protested twice and lost both times. "You didn't need to come," he murmured later when the medicine finally dulled the fever enough for him to think again. Victoria sat on the edge of a kitchen chair beside his bed, sleeves rolled slightly because she had washed a bowl and forgotten to pull them down again. "I know," she said, and the honesty of it filled the room more than comfort would have. Ava eventually slept on the couch after Victoria made toast and insisted she eat half before bed. Past midnight, the apartment quieted, rain tapping the window while James drifted in and out of sleep. Victoria sat alone at the kitchen table looking around at ordinary evidence of a life built by repetition rather than luxury. Labeled lunch containers, crayons in a mug, one unpaid utility envelope tucked beneath a notebook, a school calendar marked in careful handwriting. It was the opposite of her own apartment where everything expensive stayed exactly where it belonged, and silence remained untouched unless invited. Here, nothing matched perfectly, yet everything belonged because someone needed it tomorrow morning. When James woke near 1:30, he found her still there. "You should go home," he said weakly. "You have work." "So do you?" she replied. "You're currently failing performance review." He almost smiled despite the fever. "You always this severe after midnight, only when people ignore structural warnings." That earned the smile fully brief, but real, and something inside the room softened in a way Victoria had not experienced in years. The next morning, she left before sunrise after making sure medication times were written clearly enough for James to resent, but follow. At the office, she signed documents, chaired calls, answered board pressure. But everything around her felt slightly altered because for the first time since her divorce, she had seen a life where love existed not in declarations, but in repetition permission slips. Medicine spoons, breakfast planning, a father sleeping lightly because a child in the next room depended on tomorrow arriving correctly. Over the following weeks, that memory kept returning. Then came small invitations that were not invitations at all, coffee after late meetings, because trains were delayed helping Ava choose components for a robotics display, because James admitted hardware labels confused her, less than presentation rules. Dinner at a quiet diner where Ava talked non-stop about magnets, while James listened with tired affection, and Victoria found herself laughing without strategy. What frightened her most was not desire, it was comfort. In boardrooms, she controlled outcomes. In James's apartment, she found herself drying plates while Ava argued that pancakes counted as engineering because ratios mattered, and instead of feeling displaced, she felt something more dangerous: peace. One evening, after dropping Ava at a birthday party, James and Victoria sat in his parked car because rain had started again, and neither moved to end the conversation. The windshield blurred city lights into soft lines. "Most of the time I'm tired," he admitted, hands loose on the steering wheel, voice lower than usual. "Some of the time I'm scared I'm getting it wrong. And all the time I know there's a kid in the next room who needs breakfast homework help, and somebody calm enough to tell her the world still makes sense." Victoria turned toward him slowly. "And when you need help?" He gave a small breath that sounded almost like surrender. "I try not to need too much of it." The answer landed quietly, but it stayed, because she understood then that his pride was not vanity. It was survival shaped over years of being measured before being understood. And for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, Victoria Sterling felt her own carefully engineered defenses soften, not under passion, but under something slower, steadier, infinitely more dangerous. The possibility that home did not begin with certainty, but with showing up again when someone called your name in fear and trusting that you would still answer. By the beginning of September, what had started as something quiet between Victoria Sterling and James Carter had acquired the dangerous visibility neither of them had wanted to name aloud. It was not because either of them had behaved recklessly inside Sterling logic. In fact, Victoria had been more disciplined than ever. Governance lines remained intact. Compensation decisions stayed entirely in Daniel Reeves's chain performance reviews were documented through legal, and every meeting involving Project Atlas followed formal structure strict enough to survive external scrutiny. But companies of Sterling Logic's size did not need proof to create narratives. They only needed patterns. James appeared in the rooms that mattered because Atlas depended on him, and Victoria appeared in those same rooms because Atlas had become the company's most politically sensitive launch in 3 years. The first rumor came disguised as praise at a donor dinner on the Upper East Side when an investor smiled too casually and said, "Your engineer seems unusually influential for someone so recently hired." Victoria answered with a clean corporate smile and moved to another conversation, but she recognized the tone immediately, the suggestion hidden beneath elegance, the implication that influence had found a shortcut. 2 days later, a finance newsletter ran a short speculative paragraph questioning whether leadership objectivity inside Atlas remained insulated from executive preference. No names, no accusations, just enough language to invite suspicion. By Friday, one board member had quietly asked Daniel Reeves whether oversight safeguards around Atlas should be reviewed for optics. Daniel told Victoria after the meeting, leaning in her doorway with the exhausted patience of a man who had spent years watching power attract needless complication. "They're nervous because Atlas matters and because nervous people prefer gossip to silence." Victoria signed the file in front of her without looking up. "Atlas is performing. That has never stopped weak people from inventing stories." She should have left it there. Instead, she found herself thinking less about weak people and more about whether James had already heard versions of the same story outside the building. The answer came the following Saturday at Ava's school science showcase. The gym was louder than the STEM fair had been months earlier, packed with parents, foam boards, paper volcanoes, and too many folding chairs under fluorescent lights that made everything feel exposed. Ava stood beside a regional robotics display she had spent 2 weeks perfecting, proudly explaining sensor triggers, while James adjusted one loose cable, and Victoria listened with the kind of attention that now came naturally around the child. For almost 20 minutes, the morning felt untouched by corporate tension. Then, near the refreshments table, two mothers speaking low enough to pretend privacy, but loud enough to wound, said exactly what Victoria feared someone eventually would. "Men always know where to aim upward," one murmured. The other gave a soft laugh, "especially when the woman owns the elevator." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Victoria turned cold instantly, but what stopped her from walking across the room was seeing James already hear them. His face did not change dramatically. That was the worst part. Only a small stillness entered his shoulders, the kind that suggested the sentence had landed somewhere old enough to recognize itself immediately. He finished tightening Ava's cable, smiled when his daughter asked whether the censor looked better, and behaved as though nothing had happened. The restraint hurt Victoria more than anger would have. That night they had dinner alone for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. A quiet place downtown where low lighting tried and failed to soften what sat between them. James was quieter than usual, not cold, just measured in a way that meant he was holding back something larger than the conversation. Victoria set down her fork. "What they said today was ugly." James looked at his water glass before answering. It wasn't original. The calmness of the answer made it heavier. "You've heard that before." He gave a brief, humorless smile. "Sometimes because I'm a black man. Sometimes because I'm a single father. Sometimes because people struggle to imagine a woman like you loving a man like me, unless there's an exchange attached." The sentence landed with brutal clarity because it revealed not insecurity, but history. Years of being interpreted before being known. Victoria felt anger rise not at him, but at how ordinary the cruelty sounded in his voice, how practiced he had become at surviving it. "You know that's not what this is." "I know what this is," he said quietly. "That doesn't mean everyone else wants to." She went home carrying that sentence like unfinished damage, and because Victoria Sterling had spent her entire adult life converting fear into decisive action, she made the mistake that would fracture them. By Monday morning, she had instructed legal to widen formal separation around Atlas beyond what governance already required. Additional documentation, additional reporting barriers, more visible compliance review. In her mind, it was protection for him, for Atlas, for the company, for the thing growing between them before it could be poisoned publicly. She moved quickly because speed had always been how she survived threat. She did not tell James first because somewhere beneath the decision sat an old instinct: solve the danger before emotion complicates execution. He found out 48 hours later when legal requested new sign-off routes and copied him into compliance language he had never asked for. That evening, he waited until the floor had emptied before speaking to her in an unused conference room where the city glowed behind glass and every word sounded sharper than either of them wanted. "You changed the reporting chain without speaking to me." His voice was low, dangerously calm. Victoria folded her arms because suddenly she felt less certain than she had 2 days earlier. "I expanded protection before the board forced uglier measures." Protection. His eyes held hers without anger, yet somehow more severe than anger. "You keep trying to solve me like I'm another problem that needs structure. I'm trying to keep this from becoming ammunition." "No," he said, and for the first time the word carried visible hurt. "You're trying to get ahead of loss." She stared, because the sentence reached somewhere too exact. "That isn't fair." "It's true." He stepped closer, not threatening, just impossible to evade emotionally. "Every time pressure appears, you reach for control before trust. Legal walls, process, distance. You decide first and explain later because if you move fast enough, maybe nothing can leave before you lock it down." Victoria hated how deeply the words struck because part of her knew they were right. I was protecting both of us. You were protecting yourself from uncertainty. He left before she found an answer that did not sound defensive, and the silence afterward became worse than argument. For nearly 2 weeks he remained formal, never rude, never cold in public, but every conversation reduced to work. Every glance measured, every warmth withdrawn with enough dignity that no one else would notice, and only Victoria would feel how sharp absence could become. Atlas continued advancing. Meetings, continued investors continued calling. But inside her own life, something had shifted painfully out of reach. Then Richard called. Her ex-husband's timing had always been cruel enough to resemble instinct. He claimed it concerned a lingering settlement clarification, but within minutes he moved toward what he really wanted. Are you actually going to destabilize your company over some engineer? Victoria stood at her penthouse window, gripping the phone harder than necessary. You know nothing about him. Richard gave a low laugh she remembered too well. What worries me is that you only move this hard when you think someone represents safety. After she ended the call, the sentence stayed, because beneath his cruelty sat something dangerously close to truth. James had become more than attraction, more than comfort. He had become the first person since her divorce whose presence quieted something restless in her, and that frightened her enough to confuse love with urgency. Rumors were spreading. The board was watching. James was pulling away. Fear disguised itself as courage so convincingly that by Friday she believed she was making the bravest choice of her life when she reserved the private dining room 40 floors above Manhattan, chose the bottle of wine he liked, and told herself honesty deserved a stage beautiful enough to survive rejection. The restaurant glowed like controlled luxury glass walls reflecting city light, until Manhattan itself looked like part of the table setting. James arrived on time wearing dark charcoal, his expression calm but unreadable. He knew immediately something about the evening carried more intention than dinner, but he said nothing while the first course disappeared untouched. Victoria had negotiated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions with less internal shaking than she felt lifting her eyes to his. Every word she had planned suddenly sounded rehearsed false too late. So she abandoned the speech entirely. Will you be my husband? The sentence landed between them with terrifying clarity. For one impossible second, nothing moved. Not the waiter behind the partition, not the candle flame, not even the city beyond the glass. James stared at her hand still around his water glass, and Victoria felt her pulse climb into her throat because silence from him had never before felt dangerous. Then his face changed, not rejection first, but grief. That softness hurt more because she saw love before hearing refusal. I love you, Victoria, he said quietly. Relief arrived too soon, too vulnerable. Then came the second sentence, the one that split the night open. But I won't marry the part of you that's asking because it's terrified of being alone. She froze. Outside Manhattan glittered with merciless indifference. That's not why I'm asking. It's part of why. His voice remained gentle, which made every word cut deeper. The board is whispering. Your ex is still in your head. People said ugly things last weekend, and now you're trying to make this permanent before anything can take it away. I'm asking because I love you. I know, he said, leaning closer, eyes wrecked by the pain of saying what honesty required. But love isn't the only thing in this room tonight. She turned toward the window because facing him felt unbearable. You think I don't know my own heart? I think you know your heart, he answered softly. I'm not sure you trust it, unless there's paperwork attached. That sentence broke whatever defense remained. Because somewhere beneath humiliation she knew exactly why it hurt. He was refusing not her love, but the fear hidden inside its timing. And for the first time in years, Victoria Sterling understood that power could force timelines, buy silence, control optics, but it could not make wounded love become ready, simply because losing it felt unbearable. Victoria Sterling did not cry in the elevator down from the restaurant because years of discipline had taught her how to keep pain upright until doors closed behind privacy. But when she stepped into her penthouse and the silence rose around her like cold water, the words James had spoken returned with unbearable precision, each one stripping away the elegant defense she had built around the evening. He had not humiliated her, had not doubted her love, had not accused her of manipulation. And somehow that made the refusal harder to survive because he had looked directly into the part of her she had spent years disguising beneath competence and named it without cruelty. Fear disguised as urgency, loneliness disguised as certainty, old wounds wearing the language of forever. She stood for a long time beside the window overlooking Manhattan Hills, still on handbag, still in her hand, staring at traffic flowing below like moving veins of light while admitting something she had never allowed herself to articulate with honesty. She did not only fear abandonment, she feared being fully known and still not chosen, because that had been the deepest injury left by her marriage to Richard. Not betrayal, but the slow realization that even after years beside someone, she had remained emotionally unreadable until unreadability became the reason intimacy died. The next morning, before the office, before calls, before Daniel could hand her another board, concern disguised as urgency, she opened the contact she had saved months earlier and finally called the therapist whose name had waited untouched in her phone like a decision postponed too long. The woman answered on the second ring, and Victoria, who could dismantle billion-dollar negotiations without hesitation, heard herself say with unfamiliar difficulty, "I think I confuse control with safety." That sentence became the beginning of work harder than any merger she had ever led. Autumn arrived while therapy slowly forced truths she had outrun for years into language she could no longer avoid, that she solved emotional uncertainty the same way she solved failing systems quickly, decisively, before vulnerability could create embarrassment. That her divorce had not merely ended a marriage, but confirmed an old belief that if love was not secured tightly enough, it eventually withdrew. That even her gesture toward James, beautiful as it looked under candlelight, had carried a hidden panic she herself had not fully examined. At sterling logic, she did the one thing most unnatural to her instincts. She stopped trying to repair the emotional damage through action. She did not chase James in hallways, did not create excuses for private meetings, did not turn apology into strategy. Instead, she restored exactly what he had asked for without saying it directly, trust expressed through restraint. Governance lines around Atlas remained transparent, but no longer defensive. Legal additions she had rushed were simplified where possible. When board members pushed insinuations, she answered with calm facts and refused to let discomfort become policy. Atlas advanced under the revised timeline James had defended months earlier, and with every successful stage test, the technical credibility he had earned became harder for anyone to reduce into gossip. Daniel noticed before anyone else that something had shifted. One evening after a late review, he stood beside her desk while she signed deployment approvals and said, "You're letting silence stay silence now." Victoria looked up. "I'm learning that not every silence is danger." Daniel gave the tired smile of a man who had waited a long time to hear that from her. James noticed too, though he said little at first. The formality between them softened not through dramatic reconciliation, but through small moments that no longer carried punishment. He stopped using clipped professional distance as armor. She stopped reading every neutral expression as withdrawal. One night, after a long Atlas resilience review, they were the last two left near the glass conference room, where months earlier he had first challenged executive fiction. Victoria gathered her folder, prepared to leave, when James spoke without looking directly at her. "I was angry because you made a decision about my life without me." She turned. "I know." He nodded slowly, then finally met her eyes. "And because part of me wanted someone to fight that hard for me, even if I hated the way you did it." It was the first time he admitted contradiction instead of standing entirely inside principle, and because the honesty came without theater, it reached her more deeply than apology would have. Weeks later, on a cold afternoon in Riverside Park, the next truth arrived. Ava ran ahead chasing pigeons with the full seriousness only children assigned to birds, narrating aloud why one particular pigeon clearly had leadership issues. Victoria and James sat on a bench beneath thinning trees, coffee cooling between their hands. "I kept telling myself I was protecting," Ava James said, watching his daughter. And I was. Victoria waited, because she had learned that interrupting him too early often made honesty retreat. But that wasn't all of it. He rubbed one thumb against the paper cup before continuing. I was scared too. Scared of needing someone enough that losing them would shake the part of my life I built to stay stable. When you're raising a child alone, stability becomes sacred. Love starts to feel like something beautiful that can also rearrange the furniture without warning. Victoria looked at him, and despite everything, a soft laugh escaped. That is a terrible metaphor. For the first time in weeks, he smiled fully. I know. But accurate. His smile faded into something gentler. Too accurate. The confession changed more than any dramatic reunion could have, because now both of them stood equally exposed, not CEO and employee, not wounded woman and principled man, but two adults admitting fear without letting fear decide for them. What returned afterward was slower than the intensity they had known before, but cleaner. Victoria attended Ava's regional science fair because she promised she would and arrived early enough to help tape one corner of the display board when the school tape failed. James let her stay without awkwardness. They had dinners that were simply dinners, walks that were simply walks, and conversations no longer racing toward resolution, because both had learned that rushing tenderness usually hid anxiety somewhere underneath. Atlas launched in late winter, under the exact slower architecture James had fought for, and the success was undeniable. Systems held, investors relaxed, board pressure softened into retrospective praise from the same people who had once wanted acceleration. Even gossip faded because results made speculation boring. One evening, Daniel passed Victoria outside the executive floor and said, "For the record, choosing engineering over ego saved us all." She almost answered that choosing patience had saved more than the company, but she let the thought remain private. Winter moved toward spring, and the city softened by degrees. Until one quiet evening, almost exactly a year after James first walked into her interview room, Victoria stood in his kitchen drying plates, while Ava slept on the couch with a book open across her chest and one sock missing because bedtime had clearly defeated consistency halfway through reading. The apartment looked exactly as it had the night Ava first called her in. Fear-warm, modest, crowded with practical life lunch labels, magnets, unfinished homework. One science ribbon clipped crookedly near the refrigerator. But now the room no longer felt borrowed. It felt inhabited by shared time, by ordinary evenings accumulated carefully enough that nothing needed ceremony to matter. James came up behind her, took the towel from her hand, and set it aside. "Do you remember the first night you were here?" he asked quietly. Victoria leaned back against the counter, smiling faintly. "You had a fever and terrible judgment. You gave orders in my own bedroom. You were medically incompetent." He laughed softly, then looked toward Ava, sleeping in the living room, before returning his eyes to her. The seriousness in them carried none of the fear from the restaurant months earlier, only clarity. "I loved you. Then," he said. "Probably before I understood what that meant. But I also knew if we built anything while you were still trying to outrun pain, one hard season would crack it." Victoria felt emotion rise, but now it arrived without humiliation. And now she asked. He looked around the apartment, the dishes, the sleeping child, the ordinary evidence of life, neither glamorous nor strategic. "Now I think we both know the difference between holding on because we're afraid and building because we're ready." There was no chandelier, no skyline prepared as witness, no curated perfection this time. Only dishwater warmth still lingering in the sink, a child breathing softly nearby, and the man she loved standing close enough that honesty required no staging at all. Victoria took one breath, then another, and asked again this time, without panic hiding beneath the words, "Will you be my husband?" James smiled, not surprised, not wounded, simply certain. "Yes," he said. "Now I can." And because there was no fear left disguised as urgency, The answer landed differently than any dramatic proposal ever could. Ava stirred on the couch, half waking, saw them standing close, and muttered sleepily, "If you're both being weird, do it quietly." They laughed softly so they would not wake her fully. And in that small apartment, without applause or skyline or strategy, Victoria understood why the first answer had needed to be no, because love strong enough to last had required both of them to become honest enough to stop using each other as rescue, brave enough to admit what frightened them, and humble enough to build a home where nobody had to earn permanence by pretending not to need it. Outside Manhattan still glittered exactly as it had the night she asked too early, but now the city no longer looked like power waiting to be managed. It looked distant, beautiful, and secondary to the far quieter truth inside the room that sometimes the deepest form of love is not immediate. Yes, not dramatic possession, but the courage to wait until both hearts are steady enough to mean forever without trembling.